Okay, hi, whoever's watching, listening, or however you're consuming this content. My name's Tom Benham, and we are here with Kristen, who's going to introduce herself in a brief moment. But just to introduce myself and what we're doing here, um, Kristen and I are both part of a collective group of people, however we want to describe it, of academics, designers, builders, community people who have come together around, even describing it is a sort of pre-runner to what we're going to talk about. But we've come together around how we think we might better make sense in our sort of digital world. And the goal of these sessions is to meet the different people involved in this group and this collective and have a dialogue about what it is we think we're doing collectively and as an individuals. And to get to know each other and enable others to get to know the people in the group. So that's the point of what we're going to try and do here. The first couple of sessions here, Kristen, along with Ronan and Glenn, were the original impetus for getting this group together. So these first 2 or 3 sessions will be a little bit more about what we think the group is, but we'll also get into what Kristen focuses on and why that's important to her and what she hopes to get out of this group. So you can do a brief intro of yourself, and then I'm gonna roll straight into like what do you think the Scenius sense-making group is and why we got it together. But let's
Sure.
start with a brief background or intro to you, and we can roll into that.
Yep. I'm Kristen Pavle, and I'm a social worker by training who found my way into technology with an interest in the combo of social and technology. And so I feel like I'm still doing a version of social work. It's just in a different context. And one of the things that initially drew me to social work in the first place was all of the different places that you could practice. I was fascinated seeing people work clinically, like one-on-one, working in small groups, people working in policy, in like business, like management, like administrative. I was just like, what? You can take this degree and do whatever you want. I never at that point in time foresaw myself going into the like digital space, like any kind of internet software, like that kind of tech. So I've since found myself, I worked in healthcare consulting for about a decade or so, mostly focusing on working with people with disabilities and older adults, so long-term care. I moved into like kind of like a, I don't know, like a pivot, like right turn, like sharp angle kind of, okay, let's go take a deep dive into looking at the aspects that I've always appreciated the most. And I think this might be like the social part of the social worker in me, how people collaborate and coordinate. This is sort of the thing that I love the most in the world. So right now
Can you
in my life,
like, to interrupt your flow, can you pinpoint like the genesis of that interest or
the
passion or just,
social
yeah.
interest, I don't know. I think I'm the oldest of 4. I think family dynamics for me and just noticing how and like having high empathy because of some of like the family composition and being able to read people really well. I like to make social situations easier, I guess, and make it better, more fun for people to come together. Even as a kid, one of my like core memories of doing social design was scavenger hunts. I used to create scavenger hunts for my siblings and their friends. So I'd create this like interactive, like, I don't know, making our world into sort of like a game, like a live action game. And they would go find clues places and we're like sleuthing things out. It was just, it was fun and they loved it. So having that as like, yeah, early social experience design, I guess. I don't know. I think it's just something that's part of me because even then I was young, like potentially starting that even before I was a teenager. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
I
So
diverted you from your discussion.
no, you're fine.
Right.
I
The
mean,
right
it's a decent segue. So the work that I'm doing now, even in the health space, what I liked to do was convening people, usually internal teams, but I also would host events and conferences and that kind of like social design as well. My like focus there was more policy and analytic. Now I'm exclusively focused on community design, social design, community building. I'm a founder as well. I like to build new things. So I'm definitely drawn to bringing something new into the world, which I've always been, but kind of leaning into that more in the later years. So I consult with companies right now who are building communities as part of their business. Sometimes it's like the main focus of what they're doing, and for others, it's sort of maybe an add-on that they want to bring in to create more value in what they're doing. But more and more seeing community as part of business models, which is really cool. So helping design those out, helping to find the integration with the business. So it's not an afterthought, but it is actually part of the value in the business.
What do you think's like driving that emergence of larger focus on this idea of community within a business? I'm sure, at certain levels in large corporations, it's more of a purely, just responding to the quote market in some way, and understanding that this seems to be an emergent way to engage with their customers. But there is a genuine, I think, emergence of community as a form of sort of commercial engagement. Even, or that doesn't have to be commercial, but in terms of our digital spaces, whether it's commercial or not, this idea of community, like what's driving that, do you think?
I mean, sort of my overarching thesis in my work is that, I mean, it's sort of a basis of humans. Humans are social creatures. So
I mean, community is not a new thing, obviously.
no,
but it's emerging in a kind of new way, it may be.
Yeah, I think maybe we're just wisening up to the fact that we can be more communal in how we're offering whatever it is that we're offering, and that part of the draw, and again, the value of why people are attracted to something is because they get to interact with other people who are interested in the same thing. So I think it's just good business. And it also, it's my guess is that it's easier to operationalize as well, because, and we see this a little bit with the Scenius too. If you let other people not do the work, but like they want to talk to each other. So if you just let them do that, and you create spaces for them to do that, that relieves some of the burden on you and whatever your job is. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's community. I don't know. Or if the product is intertwined with the community, it's figuring out how to get out of the way and create. I mean, this is like emergent design. So create a container where people can interact with each other.
I think it's both creating the space and the tools to enable that, and then being able to step back and step out of that space that you've created. And whatever there's obviously certain like goals that you have in creating that space, which may be commercial or not, but it's that balance of working out what it is that's going to enable the community and then stepping back from it.
And I also think generally there's a shift in organizational structures that we're seeing, which is also a big reason for why we're seeing more community, a movement away from like inherent top-down hierarchical sort of command and control structure, which we see typically in most like corporate endeavors, which is an industrial era kind of invention. And there's something on the horizon. This is like Web3 gets into this a lot. It's the more of the decentralized and distributed ways of organizing. So there's still hierarchy. It just tends to be more emergent. And I know I've mentioned that word a couple times. It's related to context. It's who shows up in the space. And like, if we were in a room, just you and I, Thomas, like, and something came up around building software, I'm not going to be the one coding because you code, right? So you might have, in that sense, like in the software building sense, you can pull rank, so to speak. but that doesn't mean that you are like higher up in some organizational chart necessarily. So I think there's a lot of movement away from, well, this person's in charge because they're the boss kind of thing. I think we're moving into something a little bit more responsive and a little bit more, yeah, again, contextual and emergent. Like it's not baked into stone how
Right.
exactly things work. So if someone's a better leader in different contexts, let them lead.
So I want to get onto Scenius obviously and talk about what that
Yep.
is, but I just to what extent do you has the emergence of the internet, which almost sounds like it's like 20th century word. What is that? The emergence of the internet and that digital space, and how can you trace how that has driven this change that you're observing and talking about? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the internet is one of, like you mentioned, context and tools. Like you can create a container, but what are the tools? So internet or the internet as a technology, I think it goes hand in glove with this sort of move to something more distributed or decentralized, because by nature, it is a networked technology and that's how it
Right.
operates.
Right.
So I think it ushers in, and this is where you get web 1, web 2, web 3, and then within there's all kinds of different patterns for how you can organize in different networked forms. But yeah, this is, I don't know, you can get into media theory here and communications and media theory. The way that we organize tends to be highly influenced by how we communicate and what mediates those communications. So if it is the internet,
Yeah.
there's a whole new set of affordances for how people connect, and that's the social piece, that's the community piece. So yeah,
So, I mean, there definitely, seems to be a parallel if you look at survey data, particularly in America, but I think it's true globally around the disintegration of sort of physical and local communities, and then there's the emergence of communities in these digital spaces. So that's another interesting discussion. But let's go on then to, so given all that background and how would you describe or what was the motivation for the sense-making group, and how would you describe that group?
Yep.
What it's trying to achieve, what it's doing?
Yep. So Ronan, Glenn and I were friends before the Scenius. We met through different sense-making kind of projects, I would say. So I've been part of a squad, like a small collective of folks that operates under the name of Relational. And Relational was like super focused in social technology. It's something that my partner Dave and I helped to bring to life, to found. And what we were trying to figure out there was different ways of coordinating and making software, building social technology. And we invented a bunch of really cool techniques, social techniques of convening developers, designers to build together. So we had a kind of like social R&D lab kind of thing. And we were very, very interested in the collaboration and communication aspects of technology. So how can we build different tools that afford, again, this is the theme, different ways of being together. Ours focused on the internet. So how can we be together differently online? So a lot of we did mostly, because it was R&D, it was mostly prototype. We tended not to build full-fledged products. It was more of like an experimental space. So one of the projects that we were working on there was called R-Log, which could be the letter R log or our OUR log. And that was a kind of decentralized research tool that made it a little bit more accessible to just anybody that's using the internet in group settings. So we had this we used Discord to prototype it. We've built some tech around it, and we did a fundraise using Gitcoin. And what I did, I think this is how I met Ronan, because I went through and I looked up every single project on Gitcoin for that round to see who was doing communications technology. and Ronan and the Common Sense Makers were one of them.
Mhm.
So I reached out to everyone just to network, to talk to folks, and had a really strange experience because when Ronan and I don't know if it was the first time we met, but it might have been some of his crew, because they're also a squad, similar kind of idea. Like they've got a kind of, I don't know if they would call it social R&D lab, social tech
Yeah.
R&D lab, maybe though, like very similar. And the makeup of their team was very similar. It was like there was doppelgangers of each of us in the other team. And same kind of composition with men to women as well. I was the only woman on our team. There was one woman on their team. She was a nurse with like a background in healthcare. I was a social worker with a background in healthcare. It was like the strangest experience. We were like, what? And then I think that Ronan introduced me to Glenn. So Glenn was also working on a project in the space at the time, more media centric, but yeah. So we all started talking, and yeah, Ronan in particular is super social. I don't know if you've noticed this, but he talks to so many people. Like he knows like more people than I do in the sense making space. Like I
Yeah, he's
think that
definitely
because
like, as I've got to know the group and the people, he's the kind of central node of,
totally.
he's not an extrovert, but he's definitely yeah, he's a connector, and he's yeah, great at sort of like developing relationships.
Yeah. And I think because his research interests, he's in academia, lie like explicitly like on the nose about sense making, and some of the tools that he's building are in that space. He's just constantly in this mindset. So he runs into a lot of other people. And he's prolific on Twitter. Like I would say, he's definitely extroverted online. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually
Yeah.
how I met him on Twitter.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah,
Cool.
we intersected on some. We were commenting. I can't even remember what we were commenting on, but it was something, in this vein. And then we just started dialoguing, and it was interwoven with what he was doing with the common sense makers, and then we just started up a dialogue, and here we are. But that's anyway. Keep going.
Yeah. So the three of us, it just in conversation, it became clear. We started meeting because we're like, what could we build something, a community to bring people together from the different like sense making projects, because we keep running into people who are doing this kind of work and there's no central like node. Like where do we go? That's not Twitter or some other place that is, I don't know, not so conducive to sense making. That's the irony of all the social networks. They're not really good for sense making. So we had the idea, we're like, well, what if we start small? We'll each decide like we're going to invite like a handful of people. We'll invite those people in and we'll see what happens. So that was really the like initial idea behind the Sensemaking Scenius. It was anybody that came from these different corners of the internet. We're all in our own like little encampments, kind of, where we're siloed, we're isolated. But what if we traversed the expanse of the internet and found like a place that we could call home together, like so that we could share and cross pollinate, so it wasn't as lonely.
So, what would you say the goal is, if there is one,
Yeah.
of the group, of getting this group of people to get like-minded people together?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, again, this is my perspective with social technology, is the social function, bringing people together, having people have access to one another, being in community, in relationship. I think that's the primary goal. The secondary goal is that we can support each other's projects. Another secondary goal is that we might enter into projects together, maybe build things together, but everything comes from that kind of container of this social connection, this binding that we have, that we're all working on. How can we better sense make online? And that's been the focus. Like that's the central node. How can we build and create and foster, grow, whatever verb you want to throw in there, a healthier, a more, I don't know, like sane sense making environment. Yeah.
Yeah, my experience has definitely been that the group is productive, be, not because there's a specific end goal, but because there's a sort of mutual posture that everyone takes around this is what we're trying to do, and this is how I'm going to um, present myself within this group. And then from there, there's just been a whole number of different offshoots where subsets of us get interested in certain things, which may be directly related to what we're talking about here, or sort of more personal or whatever it is. And so but it's all approached in that similar sort of vein of curiosity and openness, and that has led to some really like interesting offshoots and discussions.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a mutual aid. Like there's a support, like we're co-creating together. Like
Yeah,
that's definitely, I mean, that what you said resonates too. We don't have like an explicit, and I know some people within the Scenius have been looking for, well, what are we exactly building
right.
towards? And when we we posed that question to the community, and it was interesting because this theme came up. I know I'm not alone, that first and foremost, it's a community. It's a space that I can come to and be able to socialize and connect with other people that I know speak a similar language, or that there's an easy translation in what we're doing. So we can compare notes and get support from one another, because we're all working on this in some sort of way, shape, or form. And then it's the actual artifacts, the products, the tools, like whatever's coming out of that. So there seems to be, I don't know if it's a personal development kind of thing. Like we want to take care of ourselves, and it's easier to do that when we're in relationship and with people who understand what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean it's a very good space to sort of iterate on your own ideas or products or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've definitely done is we've played a couple of games.
Yeah.
Can't even remember the first one we played because my mind is kind of focused on the second one, which is which I wanted to ask you a question about, which was how would you define sense making? And I know we kind of played a game around that and sort of created a container for dumping in content and thoughts, and we've been iterating through that. But how would you define sense making and why that's valuable?
Yeah. Dave and I were just talking about this. Sense making. Yeah, I do like Ronan's the common sense, his group, the common sense makers. I like the framing of the common sense. I think sense making is a clarity of communications between people, and like sort of the a way of sharing information that is designed for an ease of relatability, understanding. So for me, sense making, it feels, I mean, it feels inherently networky, which again, that's how humans organize, is in networks, which is why the internet's such a good combination for it. So I think sense making is, how do we better understand the environment around us and the information that we're getting through our different sensory channels or other channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think because I suppose I think of sense making as this like continuum of all the way from extremely practical sort of knowledge about a thing through
Sure.
to sort of existential sense making. I mean, making sense of the world and making meaning of the world and having meaning in your life, and that is. But everything on that continuum is there's some degree of connectedness to something. At the far end of the sort of
Totally.
the existential end, it's like a full sort of self-connectedness to the world. And at the other end, there's just you're connected to this very specific thing, like you said. And so I suppose it's somewhere along that continuum in this digital realm of sense making that
Yeah.
we're playing with through this group.
Yeah. And I think one of the things with this group in particular is the individual participation in a group larger than oneself, in a collective. Part of that participation requires some amount of higher quality sense making. Like we're trying to make it easier to communicate. We're trying across lots of different people who come from lots of different backgrounds working on lots of different projects. So we've had a lot of conversations recently around interoperability. So I
Yeah.
think there's some componentry to sense making that has to do with translation and interoperability, and how can we, again, it feels like sense making and communication feel very similar to me. They're not one and the same, but I feel like they're very aligned, because if you can't share information in a way that is, I don't know, like this is like having fidelity to what you're trying to express as an individual. There is some sort of origination from individuals, but it's this movement between individual and collective.
And to what extent then do you think we have a lot of the tools and frameworks and so forth in place? I mean, that and then there's a related question, was like, to what other projects and spaces would you see us ultimately connecting in with, in terms of protocols or projects, the Fediverse or Web3 or other commercial spaces? Like, they're sort of co-joined to those two questions. Like, do we have the tools across the sort of broad internet space to help us make sense of the world? And then specifically, what projects do you see us plugging into? And you could also talk about, there's a lot of, even if we have the tools, there's a lot of noise around them, or around sort of how we use them, which sort of creates its own deterioration of sense making.
Yeah, I'm personally interested in the more, I guess, the interoperability, the conversations that are happening between the different tools. And again, for me, it comes from a social perspective. Like my stance is almost always going to be social. That's where my expertise lies. So a lot of what the Scenius is doing is experimenting, and this is similar to relational. I feel like in some ways, Scenius is like, I don't know, an outgrowth or like a development that sort of comes out of relational, because a lot of how, at least it is emergent. I'm not the only one playing a part in the community building, but a lot of what I am trying to bring to the space is creating spaces within which we can work together to sense make across these different tools. So a lot of the experimentation and the games that you mentioned, they're sense making games, they're social games. They're not about necessarily building a tool together or building the interoperability together, but how can we get into the same place and get on the same wavelength, so that we are sharing a brain, that we have like this collective understanding together. If we can form that, if we can build trust, if we have an understanding of each other as humans and like the various tools and things that we're interested in as well, yes, from that place, then we have a really strong foundation to get into how do we interoperate, how do we create connections, because everybody has a different sensitivity into the world. So that's the kind of sensorial part of sense making. We don't want people to conform. We want people to individuate and to have expression, whatever that fullest expression is of self. You just run into the kind of Tower of Babel, where if everyone is fully individuated and isolated and in a silo, it's really hard to communicate. So just helping, especially people who build tools around this, like these very specific ideas for what the form could be of a sense-making apparatus. So helping those individuals get into the same rooms, I think, starts to influence who those individuals are, and then that influences the tools that they're making. And we'll see, I mean, natural, hesitant to use that word, but I think we are way more likely to find overlaps across the tools and find ways to connect them when we are in social relationship with each other.
So what, in terms of what's out there right now, what directionally or even in absolutely do you see as helping in this sense, in terms of creating these spaces? It may be a technology, or it just may be an application, or it may be a framework, or is there anything you can think of?
This
I mean,
one's hard.
Web3 is like a very broad domain. You could start there if you wanted, or you could, whatever,
Yeah.
anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, this like I'm pretty agnostic as far as actual technologies. I'm usually interested. This is why I like working with digital technologists. I like hearing what they think would work well in different contexts. I do like generally speaking, I think the idea around Web3, because it does focus on this decentralized distributed organizational structure, I think that is one of the most important and kind of linchpin concepts within sense making. Because yeah, I don't know if it's just like an entropy thing, but the amount of energy that it takes, organizationally speaking, to hold together hierarchies of power that exist, like absolutely. I don't know. It's not sustainable. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's the distributed, decentralized organizational patterns that humans can get into that we're not very skilled in right now. At least not in work. Like, so bringing people together to focus on some kind of outcome. We tend towards that more corporate model, the top-down hierarchy, because it's been in place for such a long time. So yeah, technically, like social technology wise, I do think it's the distributed, decentralized organizational power.
Is there like a generational aspect to this as well? It feels like we're in a transitional period, which is going to be very drawn out. Okay.
Mhm.
And so, frankly, there's almost one half of the population that is just not going to engage with Web3, or at least in a way that is technical. Like all the
No,
complexities of that current space are going to have to be completely abstracted away for people who are not technically savvy to engage in. And even those that are technically savvy, if the UX is just, as
yep.
difficult as it still seems to be in many ways, it's hard to engage with. So it's like we're transitioning into this digital communal space, and we need to find better ways to communicate effectively with each other, as we've been talking about. But it's almost like that it's one half of the population that's sort of carrying us. It's not obviously as binary as that, but it's the younger generation that are going to be more comfortable with these different
Totally.
spaces, and those coming after them, this will just be sort of native to them. Whereas the quote older generation, older people, that's going to be less. They're going to be less inclined to engage in those spaces. But so, I don't
That
even know what the
resonates.
question. What's that?
That resonates. I think it's typically, I mean, that's what you're describing as sort of a, I guess, cultural evolutionary process of development or growth. And I think that's just kind of the way of things, so to
Yeah.
speak. Pulling from Ken Wilber and integral theory. I don't know if you've gotten into that
No.
at all. Just the concept of transcend and include. So part of his theory is very developmental, the way that cultural growth happens. And it does map onto evolutionary principles, generally speaking, as well.
I mean,
So
ultimately, it's like there's this thing in the back of my mind, though, as much as we talk about Web3, or we talk about decentralized content or Fediverse or whatever, all of this has to have all of this has to be considered within the realm of its feedback loop into actual society and how we function, and
totally.
and sustain ourselves politically and economically, and so forth,
Yep.
which is another bigger sort of, I suppose, wider question. We're going to run out of time here. We've got like about 2.5 minutes. So what's the last, how can we sort of wrap this up in a way that's feels natural?
Well, let me finish my thought just briefly, transcend and include is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there is wisdom from those that have come before and the models that have come before. So I think there's this, what can we take that's working well and bring it into the future? And what do we need to reinvent? And what we are starting to reinvent. And I do think people in the Sensemaking Scenius are at the fringes of what sense making can be.
I mean, yeah, you're opening up this huge can of worms now that I wish we could have another hour or whatever to chat about. Because our sort of evolutionary pace is a much slower timescale, but we're iterating through these things now where we've got to work out a signal. We've got to work out signals in a much quicker way around what's productive versus not productive, without driving ourselves off a cliff. And
well, cultural evolution happens much more quickly,
right? Exactly,
much more rapidly, and you can get these like massive jumps.
But this cultural evolution happens as quickly as technological. Like technological evolution is obviously even another multiple over cultural evolution. Look at what's happening with AI right now, and so on and so forth. So there's these levels of sort of, I suppose, evolutionary speed, and to what extent can we?
Yeah, I've got thoughts too on when tech leads, we tend towards there's like a gap between the social and the tech. So you leave behind, like technologists will lead, but most people aren't technologists.
Right.
So then the social populace is sort of like, what's going on? We need to slow down. This is where you get all the decelerationist, like the different like groups that pop out. So
this recording is literally going to die in like a few seconds. So
we can maybe repopulate it and come back.
We can come back on that. So I'm gonna we'll sign off now, and we can hopefully revisit this conversation. Okay. But it was, anyway, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, tons of fun. Thanks, Thomas.
All right, cheers.